Today I'm speaking with Dr. Aaron Adair. Dr. Adair, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be back. Thank you.
And I appreciate you having my name on your shirt, but it is backwards. You have to switch it around, or you're mirrored.
I'm mirrored twice, once this way, once this way.
Gotcha. So that's for, of course, relating to the fact that you are at MIT. I'll give a quick bio here and then we'll jump in. Dr. Adair earned his PhD from The Ohio State University in 2013, and he has been a physics professor at Merrimack College and Babson College, as well as the high school level, and he's now a research affiliate at MIT, like his shirt, performing physics education and research using machine learning techniques. And by the way, I'd love to hear in a second, like how AI has transformed that, because since I've introduced you before in previous interviews, AI was not as big of a deal as it is now. In terms of biblical studies, he is the author of a book called The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. He's also written several articles and book chapters on the intersection of science and religion. He's also co-written a book that we did an interview on this one too, called Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide, Assessing the Impact of Discovering Extraterrestrial Intelligence on Religion and Theology, co-written with Jonathan M.S. Pierce, a wonderful friend of both of ours. And in terms of your other work, we do have I'll have the link for your Amazon page beneath this video, so please do everyone go check him out. Like and subscribe, follow him, because I'm sure there's more books coming. And also his website is draaronadair.com. I'll have that link beneath this video as well. In terms of while we're here, though, today, we're going to be talking in a few minutes about a paper you've written and some of the amazing insights you're coming up with. But before we dig into the meat of that, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and some fun things?
Yeah. Well, the intro, captures a lot of the good stuff, but my day job is in data science, which is more in private sector work. And so been doing a lot of machine learning projects there for 5 years now, more or less, which both helps pay the bills and keeps me somewhat on the cutting edge of the stuff that gets in the news a lot without necessarily working on the most gobbledygooky version of those models out there. ChatGPT is definitely interesting, but it's not part of my day job yet.
Right. How do you feel about using AI for what you do use? Does it help you yet, or are you in a different frame of what you're doing?
Sometimes it's actually been useful for coding work in terms of like translating code, or if you need some sort of basic prompt, it's like, hey, I'm trying to do this, and you're not an expert in JavaScript, and you just ask it to give you some starter code. It's like, hey, I need a red button in the upper left corner of my website. And ChatGPT or in a similar chatbot will be like, yeah, here it goes, and you can copy paste it in and do maybe touch modifications, and boom, it works. And it's like, okay, that just saved me 2 hours of work.
That's awesome. And in terms of the timing of this, we're recording this towards the beginning of December. Just for curiosity's sake, what is on your agenda for end of the year and for some of your maybe your New Year's goals or your aspirations for 2025?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of writing projects that some of them are well underway, others are in the early stages. So in particular, you mentioned earlier the Aliens and Religion book that I wrote with my friend Jonathan Pierce. We're co-authoring another book right now on the Exodus.
Nice.
And that has, forced me to crash course myself in a whole lot of things and, like providing summaries of like, where the archaeology points on these sorts of questions. But I was really surprised that I happened to trip over something, realized I should at least try to get it published before making it part of the book. And it got accepted. And I think I may have figured out where Moses comes from. I found the potentially true Egyptian origins of Moses, and then how he was later incorporated into that whole Exodus story that some guy named DeMille, that guy, he made a movie about it a couple of times.
Exactly. It's interesting timing. I was just interviewing Dr. Kara Cooney yesterday. That'll be published shortly, but of course she's asking the same kind of questions. I'm sure it's fascinating. I love that stuff, and I look forward to reading your next books and great stuff. Before we were recording, I was saying that a lot of the stuff that you kind of touch on in your research is stuff that I want to get to. And I'm more of a newbie to a lot of it, in the sense that if I was to be asked my opinion on stuff, it would be like, well, take that with a huge grain of salt. Tim needs to get more grounded in the background and so forth. But I love it because you're kind of making it easier. And I love the idea of like putting things on a silver platter for people that are new to some of these topics and saying, I know you don't know how to research all this, but I'm going to give you the grounding so that at least you, if you want to, you can dive into it. And this is a really good starting point, and case in point, what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for what you're doing. It really means a lot to us. The paper you gave us to look at today, it's called Justin Martyr and the Epistemology of Mythology, which is a fascinating title. So tell us, what are you researching and how did this start and what's in it?
All right. So this is a paper I recently just delivered at the Society of Biblical Literature. Just came back from San Diego a couple weeks ago where I presented it, and the amount of fruit thrown at me after giving the talk was very minimal, so I thought it was a success. But the main things is that this is kind of part of a larger exploration of things I've kind of tripped over and over again as I've been continuing to explore things related to the Star of Bethlehem story. So like the book I wrote about the Star of Bethlehem was primarily to say, hey, here are all these scientific attempts to explain this story. They don't actually work when you actually look at the details of the astronomy, of what the book says, of what we actually know historically, what could or could not have happened, and explain just, why we know it is fiction. And also I give what is the consensus explanation for how the story developed. That in that case, the Gospel of Matthew writer is basing it on the ideas that, hey, there's this well-known star prophecy from the book of Numbers. We got to apply it to Jesus because he's got to fit all the prophecies we can possibly do that. And this is the primary explanation for how Matthew or the Gospel of Matthew author put this together. And this always seemed like a reasonably good explanation, but there always seemed to be like a few little kinks in there that it didn't feel like it explained everything. And so, well, when you look at the little kinks, then you keep trying to see what you can do to either patch it up or look behind for something else. And this has led me to some other weird explanations of what might be behind the curtain. And when it comes to trying to figure out what's behind the curtain, there's all the stuff I can imagine, which unfortunately is too large and too hard to justify, versus what do the early Christians think about this as well? And can that give us insight to what the author may have been getting at? So it's been an exploration of what might be an even better origin for the story. And can we justify that by looking at some of the earliest Christian commenters on the story? And so the paper I gave at SBL, focusing on Justin Martyr, is the first clear author who knows the story of what we have at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. And what he says about it has also been a bit head scratching, because a lot of other experts have also been looking at it and wondering, is he reading the same book as us? Is he got his wires crossed? There are some oddities there that make us wonder what's going on. And so in my effort to understand why this guy, Justin Martyr, writing it about the 150s, why is he writing the story the way he is? Why is he saying things that not only are not in the gospel, sometimes just straight up contradicting it? How does he square that circle, and what might it actually be implying what he actually believes? So that was the big thing I was going at. And we have 3 pieces of writing that we're reasonably confident that Justin wrote. These are known as the first and second apology and the dialogue with Trypho. The first and second apology is basically just this really big explanation to, he writes it actually to the Roman emperors to say, hey, we Christians are actually so totally awesome and great, way better than all those other demigods, and you shouldn't confuse us also with the Jews or the other not real Christians. So he also, snipes at every Christian who doesn't believe exactly as he does, because only Justin knows best. And in the dialogue with Trypho, this is this pseudo dialogue that he has with not a Gentile, but a Jewish protagonist by the name of Trypho in this case. And it's written like a dialogue very similar to like the dialogues of Plato. And from that, we're supposed to see how Justin explains himself to a Jewish audience versus a Gentile audience. And so you look at the two, what's the same, what's the different, what's his sources, how does he actually make his arguments? And that was my focus of my paper, because in his apology, he notes that, hey, the Jesus story and the story of all the other gods and demigods of the Greeks, Justin basically just flat out says, yeah, they're the same. We're not saying anything new. Which, of course, makes apologists today just rip their hair out trying to deny he's actually saying that, because like, oh no, there weren't any dying and rising gods. There weren't any virgin births. There wasn't anything like this. But Justin, our first commenter that we can clearly say is reading the Gospels that we know from the modern Bible that we have, basically says, yeah, these stories are older. We know they're older. What we're saying about Jesus isn't anything new. His excuse is just that demons knew in advance what the story was supposed to be. So obviously this blows up all those attempts to avoid the sayings like, nope, there weren't any dying and rising gods before Christianity. Well, Justin's just like, no, they're there. But that actually makes Christianity even more true, because we really know where these stories come from.
Just for context, could you give us a little more information just on who Justin Martyr was. What were the dates again when he approximately lived and wrote? And was he like a church father, or how did he, play into the early church history context?
Yeah. So when he was alive, he wasn't known as Justin Martyr because Martyr is the title he got on towards the end of his life. And if you know about Christian martyrs, then you can understand why that title was attached to him. But basically, he's one of our earliest well-educated Christian apologists and writing apologetics like defenses of the faith outside the New Testament canon. So there's stuff inside the New Testament that already clearly looks apologetic. Second Peter is already trying to give excuses why the second coming hasn't happened yet, for example. But what Justin writes isn't considered sacred necessarily, but he's one of those people giving us insights to how at least one segment of Christianity was explaining itself. And also he has all these snipes at other variants of Christianity of that time. So we see the kinds of debates happening between Christians and Jews, between Christians and Gentiles, and how someone like him would try to explain things. We have a little bit of biography of Justin as given to us in his dialogue. So in the beginning of his dialogue with Trypho, he basically gives the story of how he became a Christian, that he originally was going around to all these schools of philosophy to get educated. Some of the schools he didn't like because he had to learn science and math, and he didn't want to pay for that. He eventually really goes down deep with the Platonists, and so he's taught and educated and trained as a philosopher in the Platonic school. And, the school of Plato, of course, had plenty of shifts over time, and there's influences from the other schools out there. But nonetheless, that's the sort of tutelage that he is the most reliant on, and that he'll cite the most in his own philosophical defenses. It also influences the way he writes because, as I mentioned, his dialogue with Trypho is written basically as a Platonic dialogue. Nonetheless, he gives this explanation for a conversion where basically he finds this old man who just has this argument with him, this dialogue with him that he just thinks is just so brilliant. It just on the spot converts him to Christianity. And it feels a little bit like those chain letter emails as like the 11-year-old who goes in the class and completely defeats the professor, and that child was Albert Einstein, or, those sorts of chain emails. It feels like that sort of thing. Mysterious old man has this argument that when you think about it is actually nonsense, but somehow completely converts Justin to Christianity. And then the rest of that dialogue is him arguing with Jews about how to correctly interpret the Hebrew scriptures, and also telling the Jews that they changed their own scriptures to spite the Christians. So it's also got at least the smell of anti-Semitism. If it's not actual anti-Semitism, it's close enough.
Right. In terms of just, again, given high-level context, before we get into some more specific questions, from our perspective, not from his perspective in his day, but from our perspective today, is it correct to say that we're basically touching on the idea of mythicism? We're saying that it's possible that Jesus was just another mythology, and that Justin Martyr's work gives us some reasons to think that that might be so. Is that fair to say?
So what I will say is this, is that I can't argue that Justin himself was a mythicist. I don't think that can be justified on the evidence. In fact, there's a few times where he even tries to suggest that there's actual Roman records of Jesus being killed, but the record he cites, we know, is a fiction. He cites the Acts of Pilate, and he even uses a Greek word to pretend like he's actually reading this off a Latin document. It's basically a Greek transliteration of the Latin word act or actus. So he's at least acting like he's got this actual Latin record, but we know what this record is, this Acts of Pilate, because we have copies of it. And it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely fan fiction.
Interesting.
So whether he's actually citing that facetiously or not, or just to cover himself, it's hard to say. But nonetheless, what my argument is that he is going to show us how he reads, interprets, and understands what the gospel stories are saying, and that he doesn't actually think the gospels are the gospel truth, that they're actually going to hide a deeper truth in them. And he ultimately, I think, is basing this on the way he interprets myth generally, because of his background as a Platonist. In fact, he'll argue that Plato got all of his ideas from Moses. So even after converting to Christianity, he can basically say all the Plato stuff he learned, he's just going to say, I can copy paste that over to Christianity. And this includes things like myths have other meanings than what they seem to be literally. We shouldn't take them literally. And importantly, he also is a believer, or at least Plato is a believer in what we call the noble lie, you tell a story to outsiders that isn't true, but gets them to conform the way you want to. But once you become an insider, you might learn the actual mysteries of what those things are. And Justin in particular will use the language of parable, of symbol, and mystery a lot, referring to both Jewish and Christian writings.
That's the term mystery cult.
Exactly.
It's interesting. Do you feel like as you look at this stuff, and again, I'm just kind of starting with some high level stuff, but do you feel like there's any sense of a primer that they were willing to sort of divulge, share their cards and say, like, look, if you could understand, for example, the movement of the stars, if you could understand the secrets of, numerology and gematria and some of the stuff with Pythagoreanism, if you could understand maybe even harmonics and music, like the Pythagoreans, if you could understand some of the deeper allegories, perhaps, where, when I say this, what I really mean is that, but it's like, it's always this for that. It's always a one for one. And like a, hint. And sometimes when you look at the Gospels, it almost looks like they're trying to go out of their way to give you clues. Like, for example, you mentioned Plato, and I always think whenever I see Jesus heals the son of Timaeus, like everybody will be like, bells going off. I know what you're talking about. I know what Timaeus is. It's like our Bible, that, Homer's Odyssey. And, you look at the road to Emmaus, and Emmaus is one of those guys in Homer's Odyssey that was like the whole motif of like, he's a hidden character, but you can recognize him by the scars. It's like they're using the words Timaeus and Emmaus and a lot of other things like that, that somebody that knows what's sort of the inside track will be like, I know what you're doing there. And I, hint taken. Thank you. I got it. I got the point. Yeah. But everyone else would be like,
that's a stronger hint than that, though, because in Mark 13, where he's giving the discourse about the end time stuff, he's also saying to his illiterate audience in the story, let the reader understand. Right. That's basically Jesus turning to the camera and saying, hey, guys, I'm talking to you directly, reader.
The original Office.
It has that sort of, reality TV sort of aesthetic to it, just in those little moments of, turn to the camera, make the audience clear. It's like, hey, I'm talking to you directly. I'm breaking the fourth wall, even though that concept hasn't been written about yet. And I think there are hints as well from later writers as well, that there are mysteries that you need to join in and basically move up the ranks to get that. So in the letters of Ignatius, he says that there are like things that he's not supposed to talk about. Paul has these statements in his letters about that there are these mysteries that you basically have to like learn to drink milk as a child before you can eat the meat as an adult. Origen takes that concept and run with it. And I see hints of it as well in Justin, not only in using the language of mysteries and mystery cult language like that, but he'll even tell his interlocutor in that dialogue, you need to join the Christians to really understand the meanings of these texts, of what's going on there. And I think if I look at the places where he seems to be contradicting himself, it's because the background message, the esoteric thing, is breaking through, which means it contradicts the exoteric text that he's citing.
Just a quick curveball question. I know we're not going to focus on this much, but just curious, your penny for your thoughts on this one. Do you, like, what we're talking about so far is just information. Like if you knew the inside information, you would get it. If you don't know the inside information, this is going to sound like it's, some literal thing to just take at face value. But do you think that there's any sense that they were also kind of hinting at psychedelics with some of this, where like the mystery knowledge is not just like, you need to know what this refers to. You need a primer. You need to go to a secret class or whatever. You actually need to like experience something. And if you don't experience it, information won't help you. You think that's possible?
Well, we definitely know from the letters of Paul, from the book of Revelation, that people having visions was considered a legitimate source of information, of knowledge. So in theory, if you could achieve that state through drugs, through some sort of chemical, it seems like that's not absurd. I just don't know of anything that we can directly show that the Christians were using that to that end, but it's certainly not at all impossible. And I mean, some of the drugs of the time were, just like today, completely normal, like wine, alcohol generally is abundant today. It was abundant back then, and it didn't necessarily have the connotations that like we have, for example, with cocaine. It's like, oh, you're on crack, you're terrible. But yeah, go ahead and have 5 beers. That's no problem. It's like, it's still intoxicants, it's still drugs and all that. And the same thing in antiquity. Obviously, somebody getting so drunk that they go blind is a problem, but still, they assigned wine to a really important god, Dionysus. And being in the Dionysic spirit is commendable, at least in certain cultic activities. So I don't see it as impossible. I just don't know if we have enough direct evidence to make the case.
Right. I guess what I'm alluding to is that I think there's a lot of things I've seen over the years that talk about the other mystery cults would use psychedelics and things like that, where they would be doing things in a psycho and sometimes a psychosexual sense with the temple prostitutes and so forth, and that was just part of the ritual, and that you could kind of get taken to a higher level through these experiences in the temple. It wasn't just go to the temple and have sex with a prostitute. It was like this was a spiritual experience. And to think, okay, well, if we know that they're doing it in these other mystery cults, and then Justin Martyr comes along and says, we're not that different from these other people. Like, it just makes me wonder if there's some crossover there. But I know that'd be something we couldn't prove necessarily, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
When you
at
look
least not on current evidence, but I could imagine a way we could prove it if we were to, find a really early church, and in the same sort of way. It was in the headlines not too long ago. Basically, some altar place in 7th century northern Israel finding, hey, there's chemical residue here from marijuana-like plants. Yeah. If we found that in a Christian context from like the 2nd century or something, that would, I think, be evidence. So in theory, we could find that evidence. I just don't know of any as of yet. But hey, we keep digging in Rome. Who knows what we're going to find? We might find the early edition of Christian High Times.
Exactly. Well, we know for sure that Christians these days are smoking something. That's for sure. When Justin Martyr is trying to, distinguish Christian theology from the Greco-Roman mystery cults, it seems like it's an interesting dynamic that you're referring to, where it sounds like he's trying to both walk the fence of saying we're like you, but we're also not like you, bringing in the demonology aspect, like the demons did this to you, they tricked you in advance, but we're the real deal. How successful do you think he was when he was arguing with them at both convincing them this isn't a big stretch because you're already doing 80% of what we're doing. We're doing the same things. We just kind of put a new twist on it, but also to sort of kind of assuage those people that said you guys are weird. But also at the same point to assuage the Christians and say, but this is the real deal. Like C.S. Lewis's thing. This is the real mythology, the one real one. How do you think he kind of walked that fence?
Yeah, so I'll first give you the idea of like how he tries to explain the similarity and why the Christians are better anyways, and then how successful he was amongst intellectual elites and maybe more the hoi polloi. I shouldn't say the hoi polloi, that's redundant. The hoi and hoi polloi is the word the. Okay.
We're getting a Greek class as well.
It'll be a very bad Greek class, but I'll try. All right, so the way Justin tries arguing things is that he first takes as a premise that the oldest body of holy scripture, of writings based on interactions with the divine, is the writings of Moses. So the 5 books of Moses, that's the oldest holy text in the world. And everything after that about the Greeks and Romans and their gods is derivative of what Moses wrote. So that is his main starting premise. And he doesn't defend it in his writings. He's probably dependent on people like Josephus who try to make a similar argument. And he says, yeah, from historical reasoning, we can say that Moses was the oldest prophet of all. And his writings are well preserved by the Hebrews. And that's why, of course, the Jews and the Jewish religion is just so gosh darn awesome.
Of course, ignoring the Hindus and all their much older religions.
Yeah. It doesn't really go so well there. I mean, they knew about Hinduism and Buddhism. They knew about Brahmins and things like that, but apparently not enough to make it matter to them, because almost all their focus was on demigods like Hercules or Heracles or the Mithraeus or the Isis Osiris cult, things like that. That was their main focus because those were the real competitors in town. If there weren't any Buddhists walking by, they didn't seem to care that much, so it seems. But ultimately then saying, hey, Moses has the oldest writings, but there are all these demons who are trying to understand and imitate what the prophecies of Moses are saying is going to happen. And so the demons didn't quite understand those prophecies, because you need to have the Holy Spirit basically to understand them properly. You have to be of the right sort of mindset to interpret them correctly. And so that's why you get all of these other gods that are kind of like Jesus, because they're all imitating what Jesus would be, but doing so imperfectly. So Mithras is said to have been born in a cave because that's what you would get from reading Isaiah 33, according to Justin. But really, this happened to Jesus because Jesus is born in a cave. Now, you might be wondering, well, which gospel is that in if you open up your Holy Bible? And it's like, well, unless you have some additions to your Bible, you don't see that. That only shows up first in what's called the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the Infancy Gospel of James. That's the first gospel-like text that talks about Jesus born in a cave. But Justin might be saying that earlier. Dating is a little bit hard to know there. But my guess is Justin is first, and then other people are like, okay, copy paste.
It almost seems like one of those time paradoxes, like from the sci-fi movies, where it's like, if you could look in reverse, you know what I mean? Where they're trying to, it's as if they could see in advance, in 100 years, Christ is coming, or in 200 years, Christ is coming. He's actually going to be born, and we can see it. But let's take our little TARDIS and go back 200 years earlier and create some copycats and see if we can mess the timeline up. It almost seems like a sci-fi thing, you know?
Yeah. Unfortunately, in his view, at least, it doesn't seem to require time travel. It's just that the demons of the past are reading the scriptures, not quite understanding it. You know, they probably are also falling asleep reading all the begats, because that was me too. It's like, and then he begat him. Wow. That is unfortunately good chunks of the Pentateuch, unfortunately. Nonetheless, that kind of explanation is then used to explain why there are similar stories out there to what the Jesus story would have. But then Justin has to say the reason Christian interpretation of the Old Testament is correct is because the Christians are actually the bestest people in the whole wide world. If you have true religion, if you have basically true contact with the divine and the true understanding of the myths or stories delivered to you by divine sources, you're going to do good. He actually basically gets this from Plato. So in Plato's Republic, he talks about the sorts of myths that should be created and propagated across the populace, that the best sorts of myths will produce the best sorts of societies. So you could run that argument backwards. If you have the best sort of society, you must have the best sort of myths, or the best understanding of those sacred texts. So that seems to be his logic. That's part of his, as I say, the fancy word for this is epistemology, his theory of knowledge. So if the Christians are behaving well, that must be because they have the right stories or the right interpretations of stories. Therefore, they're interpreting it correctly.
How did he get received by the Christians, and I guess more importantly, the Christian apologists of that day? Did they see him as fringe, or did some of them accept him? Do we have any idea as to how history recorded his associations?
Yeah, so it's a little bit mixed. So first off, he is definitely dead set against many other Christian sects. So he'll call out Marcion and his branch of theology, and similar quote-unquote Gnostic groups. And I have to say quote-unquote because the more and more research is done on Gnosticism, the less of a useful category it is. But basically, all the branches of Christianity that we would no longer consider orthodox, because Justin will kind of fit in that tradition. He'll get cited, or works of his that are lost will get cited, especially like his critiques of Marcionism kind of get developed along with other refutations or attempted refutations of Marcion, kind of collecting together. So he has that legacy for later times, though he probably doesn't have as big of an impact as, say, Irenaeus or especially Eusebius and Augustine. In the same sort of way with political commenters going on TV or on radio or podcasts and that, they don't necessarily have to go and make arguments that's convincing to everyone. All they have to do is make enough of a case to basically run cover for people to stay in the group. Make it so it doesn't feel ridiculous or terrible. So you could do something absolutely clearly awful and terrible, but you run enough interference, you can kind of sort of get away with it. It feels that sort of way. The arguments clearly does not convince the direct target of Justin's writing. So like I say, his apologies are written to the Roman emperor. And if you check your history books, you're going to see that Marcus Aurelius did not become a Christian among other emperors. You don't have Christian emperors until, a couple centuries later. And even then, there's a little bit of backsliding and then back and forth. Fun in the 4th century is one way to put it.
Do you think he had much of an influence on the discussions overall? Like, was he a one-off? Was he an interest, it's great that his works got preserved, but he didn't really have much influence? Or do you think he was one of those people that actually sort of got some traction in these discussions? And how, like, do we know if, even though Marcus Aurelius wasn't changed by it, were there some Greco-Roman philosophers that might have been appreciating this, or anyone else? Or was this, like, how fringe was he at that time, do you think?
At least amongst the Gentiles, like the non-Christians, it seems like nobody cared about him per se. And the closest I can think of is when I read the criticisms of Christianity through Celsus. We only have in quotations from a later Christian, Origen. So Celsus is writing in the late 2nd century, Origen late 2nd, early 3rd century, and Origen has this big book called Against Celsus, Contra Celsum, or Contra Celcum, if you're reading this in the Latin more, as you do, of course. It has a lot of quotes of Celsus, and we can then reconstruct at least some of his argumentation. And some of it feels like indirectly responding to the kinds of arguments that Justin makes. In particular, the way that Justin will try to argue about how to interpret non-Christian myths and the Christian stories, because Justin is going to come along and say, the Old Testament, totally true, 100%, absolutely, not a jot or tittle is wrong, unless the Jews touched it. And of course, put the Jews with all the anti-Semitic dog whistles there because it has that sort of feel to it. But nonetheless, that's all true, real, but it's hidden in symbolism, and the Christian literature, you also have to understand and appreciate it for its symbolic value, that there's some sort of deeper truth to that. And Celsus basically comes along and says, a whole bunch of Christians are reading this stuff literally. The more educated Christians say, oh, it has to be symbolic. And then Celsus also says, but they're just making up BS so they don't look like fools. There's actually no deeper meaning to these texts. This is just a bunch of writings from superstitious rubes trying to not look as goofy as they seem to him. Interestingly, the Christians will do that right back to him, because Celsus will basically look at the gospel story and say, this is clearly ridiculous. There's no legitimacy here. This is a myth based on a bunch of hysterical women. That's like one of his criticisms about the empty tomb story. Origen, conversely, also will have some things throwing back at Celsus, because Celsus will say there are other myths in the Greco-Roman world. For example, on the island of Crete, there is the tomb of Zeus. Now, of course, Zeus is supposed to be an immortal god. How can he have a tomb? So what's going on there? According to at least Celsus, there is some other symbolic meaning for this. There's some sort of mystery here that you basically have to learn about to understand what this is actually supposed to be symbolizing, what's its purpose. And this wasn't a nobody place. This was actually a fairly frequented tourism spot in the classical world. So you could go and get your picture next to the tomb of Zeus, body not included. Celsus will Celsus will say there's a deeper meaning. Origen will say, no, there is no meaning. We know all Cretans are liars. He actually cites that famous saying, all Cretans are liars, which has an interesting little contradiction to it, because that was said by a Cretan. The Cretan says all Cretans are liars. You got the liars paradox.
Isn't that too in the pastoral epistles? Is it 1st or 2nd Timothy?
Yeah, I think it's 2nd Timothy, yes. So if you want an infinite logical loop, you could just go to that one letter and just be spinning it forever.
So just so I'm clear, so we have a bunch of different Christian groups at the beginning of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them saying that this is a copycat, not copycat, but this is another acceptable mythology within the milieu of all the other mythologies. There's a lot of parallels, and we're kind of just doing the same thing that you all are doing. So don't act like we're doing something weird, because we're very much like you. There's a lot of carryover. Mm-hmm. Some other Christians are obviously at some point saying that's not true. This actually happened in history. Do we know, like, at what point that argument began to take off, and in the sense of people saying, like, because a big part of this is the timeline, because if nobody was saying it was historical for the longest time, and then someone, 250, 300 AD starts to say it, it's like, it's more suspicious. But if someone's saying it in the first 50, 60 years, like, no, this actually physically happened. We know my great grandfather so-and-so was there at the cross. Then it's a little bit different. At what point does the argument of historicity become, as far as you know, become a big argument where someone like Justin Martyr is going to get kind of shot down by the literalists?
So it's a little hard to answer that, because some of it will depend on the dating of the books of the New Testament, because 1st Timothy is saying, hey, let's stop worrying about all these genealogies and those sorts of things. It seems like there's issues there. Second Peter having to make excuses for why the second coming isn't there, but also we got these eyewitness reports to what really absolutely did happen. I was there. Guys, I saw it happen. But when was Second Peter written? That's hard to say. One thing, though, we are a little bit more confident about is that in Justin's time, he was arguing with literalists because one of the criticisms against Marcion was that he was a literalist. Part of the reason he rejected the Old Testament is he read it literally. So when it talks about Adam and Eve in the garden and God is asking where they are, he reads that literally. Oh, God doesn't know where they are. This God isn't omniscient. So this can't be, the almighty creator of the universe because doesn't know they're on the other side of those bushes over there. This can't be an omniscient being. That sort of literalism drives him from basically interpreting the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, as to him indicating it's either nonsense or it's indicating that the God of this book can't be the God of Jesus. This can't be the God that's great and wonderful. And he also apparently will treat his own scriptures, his own version of the New Testament literally, or other people's text literally. We have this as a criticism amongst others. So, for example, in the saying from Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew that those who really, really, really want to be the bestest of Christians aren't going to be just simply celibate. They're going to castrate themselves to really stay there. And Marcion reads that literally, says, well, clearly Jesus didn't say this because this seems like nonsense. And if you guys were real Christians and you really believe this, you'd all be speaking an octave higher right now.
Exactly. It's amazing to me, just a couple of quick reflections. You know how today there's thousands of denominations arguing that they have the right interpretation or the right Christian culture. And it's crazy to me that that dynamic has just always been there. From the earliest days, all the different Christians are arguing, we've got the right one, we've got the right one. But also thinking about like what the missionary perspective would be like for them to say, what I mean is today, when I was an evangelical Christian, everything was very literal. Jesus came and he died for you and he rose again. This is history, and it's God intervening in time and space to save you. And it makes me wonder like how they would have approached missions and sharing the gospel back then for the people that would have said that this is not literal, that this is allegorical, this is metaphor, and to think, were they trying less to evangelize and more to get initiates into a mystery school where they would have to explain this stuff, whether it was through psychedelics or something else, just, understanding Platonism and Pythagoreanism? Like, how do you think some of those conversations would have gone when they told newbies, say, hey, can I tell you about Jesus? Oh, no, I don't know who that is. What are you talking about? What do you think they would have said if they were following Justin? What would have been the message to get a new convert?
It sure seems like that they would present them the straightforward story from the Gospels or similar kinds of stories and treat them just as here's the sort of thing that you were supposed to believe. Here is the good news. And only later on would you find out there's even more to it. So basically you can imagine it kind of like, hooks them in. You give them this sort of story and tell them, but wait, there's more. But you then have to like join in and climb the ranks to learn more and more. So it feels like many other cults that, they'll bring you in perhaps with the more easier to accept things and then the more difficult things to understand or even just to learn in the first place. That's for later initiates. And we know this is like how mystery cults worked at the time. One of the stories that we have from antiquity is it's actually a novel, but it seems to be showing how you level up in the cult to Isis. So this is I'm forgetting the author of the book, but the story is called The Golden Ass. And gentleman who basically gets in trouble with the gods, gets literally turned into a donkey. He literally makes an ass of himself. And he has to basically go through, do penance to basically be cured by Isis. And he becomes a true believer, joins the cult, works his way up the ranks. And the story like talks about the ranks. And even though the earlier part of the story is, clearly written like this hysterical sort of, satirical fashion, when you get to like the last portion where he's talking about like going up the ranks and that, it feels reverent. So it makes a lot of scholars look at this and say, this might be like really how this particular cult actually worked and how other cults seem to work. We know from what little we can from the Mithraic cult that there were levels as well, that you had to go up the ranks. And often the ranks did require a little bit of moolah. So there's a financial reasoning to how this works as well.
When you look at some of the ways that history, ebbs and flows, sometimes it seems like you see these seed forms of certain ideas that later become like a much bigger deal. Like, for example, Martin Luther's anti-Semitism becomes kind of the underlying framework of World War II in Germany, and their anti-Semitism that just goes obviously to such a horrible degree. But you get the sense that what Justin Martyr was believing and proclaiming, did it become, as it were, a branch of Christianity? Did it die out? Was it more just like a few fringe people kind of kept talking about it? But like, how did it evolve once he kind of came and went?
I don't think it's ever left Christianity of finding other ways of symbolically trying to read the stories. I mean, if you go to a mass and the sermon is being given by a priest, they'll have, of course, some sort of reading, but then they're going to try to interpret it to make it somehow valid or reasonable or useful for your current day-to-day life. And you got to do some legwork to make anything like from, say, the stories of David in, 1000-ish BC work in 2024. So there's always going to be some reinterpretation or highlighting or unhighlighting certain parts. That has been the tradition always. And to what extent various people believe the things literally or symbolically, that probably ebbs and flows a lot. So in the writings of St. Augustine, he doesn't believe in 6-day literal Genesis story, but as far as I know, he did believe in the worldwide flood. So what parts are literal, what parts are not, it seemed to always be that argument. How do you figure out which things are which? There's often some underlying reason why you're making those choices, and sometimes it's just to look less foolish. That's actually one of the things that Origen argues, that you should be learning just enough like science, not for the sake of science, but just so that way when you talk to other people, you don't sound like a blubbering idiot. If you basically say, join our cult of flat earthers, you're not going to have that much appeal. Even in antiquity, you would have been slapped up by everyone who's had a modicum of education or has even traveled far enough south to notice the stars change. But nonetheless, when it comes to Justin himself, his sorts of ways of interpreting and creating stories by interpreting, we see well into the Middle Ages. So one of the things I did in my talk and my paper was showing, hey, here are things that Justin believes that Jesus did or will do based not on any actual eyewitness report. And he says he knows that because of his reading of the Old Testament. And Justin does this to say why Jesus was born in a cave. How Jesus, when he went to heaven, he went through a bunch of gates because of what he read in the Psalms. And mind you, there's no way he could have an eyewitness report for that because eyewitnesses are not in heaven. But he knows this just as well as anything else, so it seems. And in later stories of Jesus, sometimes they are explicit in how they're creating their stories. So there is a gospel in Latin. It's called the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. It's 6th century-ish AD, hard to be sure. It says that it was guaranteed to be true by Jerome, that there's like a cover letter to it from Jerome saying it's legit, but even the cover letter is actually forged. But nonetheless, nice. It has the basic story of the birth story of Jesus. You can see it has, here's elements from the Gospel of Matthew, here's some elements from Luke, and then there's some other additions, like the animals that you see at Jesus' birth. A donkey, an ox, things like that. Well, that's not in the canonical story, but in any nativity set, you see that. This comes from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, and it is explicit. It says, these animals were here in fulfillment of this prophecy from Isaiah, or no, I think in that case that was from Habakkuk, saying the ox will know its master and such. And later in that same story, when Jesus and family are running off to Egypt, they stop for a while and a dragon comes out, as they do. And Jesus, as a baby, hops down from Mary, tells the dragon to, knock it off, and basically tames the dragon. Again, in fulfillment of prophecy. In their case, I think he cites something from Isaiah 40. Don't quote me on the chapter, but I think from Isaiah, this talk about dragons being controlled by the Lord. Jesus, of course, is that, so he can tame dragons as a baby. Obviously, this strikes us historically as absurd, but this story was, again, justified by appeal to prophecy, and it influenced later Christian writings and imagery. So you can find some like Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox icons of Jesus as a baby battling dragons.
Wow. I tell you this, the more that I learn about early Christianity and all the ways it's evolved since then, it just is like, it's just one big mess. I mean, it's fascinating, of course, as a academic exercise to study it, but then when you think this stuff is now at the highest levels of our government, and people with nuclear codes believe that they're praying to Mother Mary or whatever, it's really, it blows your mind that this stuff is real. But I guess in terms of trying to go back historically, this kind of stuff, even though it feels weird to us today, it feels like, might as well be talking about the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. To them, this was kind of their bread and butter. This is just what they did. Is it fair to say that we're kind of removed from how weird this sounded to some of them, and that to them this wasn't that weird, perhaps?
I mean, in some ways, we are still in the legacy of that sort of thing, because many people do believe in lying for the greater good, and even promoting the idea of the noble myth as a way to control the masses and get them in the right direction, even if they don't really understand what's going on. Just some people are more explicit about that than others. I mean, we've also seen that somewhat recently in our politics, where we see the political playbook. They deny they're going to use the political playbook. They win the election and they say, this was the playbook the whole time. Get ready for our version of fun. And so it's like, yeah, people are happy to lie to your face for your own good in their point of view. So
it's interesting, though, that there are people within that framework for whom they're not seeing it as a noble truth. And I guess that those are, to me, the scary ones, where they actually believe it. Like when they say, we believe Christ is King of America, and we're going to make it visibly part of what we do with our laws and our education of children and so forth. Like, they mean it. And I think that's what's scary, is that, and maybe Justin Martyr was doing us a service to saying, by saying, like, no, guys, you're taking it too seriously. You're missing the point. When you go literal, you're missing the boat. And also you're staying at this first level when there's a second secret level that we need to get to. But the people that can't ever get to the second level, if there is a second level to get to, if they can't get there, they're stuck. Well, no, this is actual history. Those are some of the scariest people out there. And I don't know, maybe it makes me wonder if Justin was foreseeing, as it were, some of the damage that could be done by people saying this is actual literal history. But I'm sure he wasn't thinking of where this would go. But does it seem like there was any discussion, as far as you're aware of, in terms of just how did this thing start from their perspective? Not how do we interpret it, but like if you were looking, for example, at these gospels, and there was the gospel of this and the gospel of that, we know that there was at least like 50 or 60 gospels, and some people have argued, I think fairly well, that there's probably originally hundreds of them, at least with the variations included. And for people to say, yeah, but like, where did this start from, and how do we know who wrote this and that? And not how do you interpret it, but why are we even taking their word for granted? Why are we trusting them? If you want to know Jesus, why don't you just go, smoke something really strong and actually have your own experience, and then write your own gospel, for goodness sake? Does it seem like they were concerned about figuring out where this thing started from?
So it probably changes from generation to generation. And one of the things that kind of tells me that is that the way the debate changes, including within Christian groups, because when I look at Justin, and then I look later, say, at Irenaeus, and I want to focus in particular how he refers to the Gospels, because he is clearly aware of and citing Matthew and Luke. Maybe John, it's a little bit sketchy there, but Matthew and Luke, he clearly seems to know, but he never calls them Gospels, and he never says the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark. Instead, he refers them as the memoirs of the apostles. And it's worth noting that he is not saying these are written by the disciples. He distinguishes between disciples and apostles. And in another place, he says these are the memoirs of the apostles and those who came after them, which basically makes it sound like, hey, this is some ongoing thing that people are writing into. It's almost like ongoing revelation of knowing about Jesus this way, which is not how you do historical reasoning. And when it comes to who are apostles, he names a few apostles, and one of them he names is John of Patmos. So he cites the book of Revelation as not written by like John, son of Zebedee, the author of the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John. He's saying the person who wrote that fever dream of the book of Revelation is an apostle and is giving us reliable information about what Jesus is up to. That is not how you tell us you are doing historical reasoning. And the other thing that I observed in my talk is, here are all the places where we can see Justin knows the gospel story and actively contradicts it. So let me give a couple examples, and it might show how he thinks about these stories in the first place. So in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus comes to Jerusalem, he tells his disciples, go get me a donkey and so I can ride that in to fulfill everything that needs to be done, etc. And he does that. He hops on one animal and hallelujah, Hosanna the highest, all the catchphrases as he's coming in. In Matthew, as people have noted for quite a while, the oddity is that Jesus tells his disciples to go out and get a donkey and the child of that donkey to come and bring two animals, and Jesus rides on them. And apologists will also be in a tizzy to somehow explain that this isn't actually a contradiction between the previous thing, or somehow how Jesus is riding one animal, but it counts as two, or he's straddling both. There's all sorts of ways that this tries to get imagined. I personally like the idea of a stacking, so one donkey on top of the other with Jesus on top of the pile. But that probably won't fit in the gate. So nonetheless, this is odd, this is weird, and Justin cites both of these stories and says they both fulfill Scripture. Well, as we all know, 1 does not equal 2. And yet Justin seems to cite both and say both of them are in fulfillment of Scripture, that they all both have some sort of symbolic purpose to them. So if Justin is happy to take two contradictory stories and say, yep, both of them, this cannot be someone who is treating them literally. He has to be saying, this has some other purpose. And for the Matthew story, he says, well, the reason there are two animals here is like one represents the Jews, one represents the Gentiles. I think that's how he puts it. So this is him basically controlling the two kinds of beasts out there. That is the kind of argumentation he has. He'll also add to the story. So he also says the donkey was tied up to a grapevine. If you go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that's not in there. But he says this happened because that's what it says happens in Genesis 39, if I remember correctly. I might have the chapter wrong, but in Genesis, this is where he's saying that there's this prophecy from there about this one donkey being tied up to a grapevine, and this is what Jesus is fulfilling. So he has to add in the detail that donkey was tied up to this grapevine. Again, it's not in the Gospels, but he knows this. How can he possibly know this? It can't be based on historical reasoning. It's not because he has documentation. It's that he must have because of Justin's reading of the Old Testament. So he's adding details. He's throwing in contradictions between the Gospels, and to me, some of the most straightforward contradictions between the Gospel story that he has is in the birth story. So when we talk about the Magi, so if you flip open your Bible and switch to Matthew chapter 2, and it says, and then depending on your translation, wise men from the east, or kings from the east, or magi, or astrologers from the east, etc. Those are the various translations you'll see out there. When you see the phrase from the east, you're probably thinking, okay, well, what's east of Israel? What's east of the Holy Land? You're looking at modern-day Iraq, Iran, that kind of region. So most people would interpret this as, oh, these are people from Babylonia or from Persia. And the Magi were Persian priests. So, hey, that makes a lot of sense. That must be what Matthew's going at. What does Justin say? Magi from Arabia. That's not east. And then he says, from Damascus. That's neither Arabia nor east. Damascus is basically north of Israel, and only occasionally did like a Arab king ever take control of that region. So it's like, what are you talking about? This definitely wasn't true at the time of Jesus. But he says, but this is to fulfill Scripture that the Magi came from Damascus, which was Arabian territory, and they came because they were controlled by demons until they came and worshiped Jesus. That's not in my Bible. It's in clear contradiction to the story I have, and even more so with my favorite part of the story, the whole Star of Bethlehem thing. In the same paragraph, in the same line of text from Justin, he will say, there was a star at Jesus' birth, and in fulfillment of Scripture, Jesus is a star. So he's putting the contradiction right there. It's like, there was a star at Jesus' birth, Jesus is a star. These are not the same thing. And yet he sees no problem putting these two things right next to each other. And the only way things like this can even begin to be coherent is if he looks at the gospel story as not historical, but as something to be interpreted. And so I then try to pull back and figure out what's the story that he's saying is behind the curtain. What does the Wizard of Oz try to hide from me?
It's amazing the levels of bullshit that Christians have come up with from the very beginning. It sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, that they had this perspective just at such an intense level to say all of the scriptures that we count as like divine scriptures that have come before the time of Jesus and whatever they're imagining, whatever he would have lived. And I know there's some differences there as to how to interpret that time frame, but just for what we all kind of think of is when Jesus was probably alive. They're saying all these scriptures from the centuries before were written about him, and as if it was like a double entendre. And so we need to basically go back and figure out how to see this, but they're not saying, let's start with what Jesus did, and let's see where the prophecies were. They're saying effectively, we haven't got a clue what Jesus did. We're just going to it's like a blank slate. Let's figure out what do we want to say Jesus did. So to write this story, they're going to go back to the Old Testament, back to these prophecies, and try in some way to take things way out of context and then make a story out of it. Is that kind of in the seed form what they're doing?
At least in part, because this was actually standard procedure amongst at least literate readers of the Hebrew scriptures. So we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they were coming up with all sorts of ideas for the ends of times based on how they were combining scriptures together, and sometimes in ways that are quite fantastical. Let's take, for example, Melchizedek. He gets mentioned real quick in Genesis chapter 14, and he's basically just some dude who just shows up one day, says, "Hey, Abraham, you're cool. Bless you." And that's basically the story. In one of the scrolls at Qumran, it's literally called the Melchizedek scroll, and Melchizedek is basically a man from heaven who's going to basically bring judgment on the world. How did someone square that circle? That required a lot of interpretive effort, because it definitely isn't based on historical evidence. They are not doing that kind of reasoning. And the way they did it, the way that they are using what's often referred to as the Pesher technique of finding ways of combining text based on either common themes or common language, sometimes even just a particular word that's in common in two verses, to find how to mix the two things together, or just create some sort of ongoing interpretation as like a bunch of beads based on your starting point. This is standard procedure we see in the in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see it in the later rabbinic literature. It's clearly also what Paul is doing because of the way that he'll mix things together. And it's just like, this is the way that they create knowledge. They really think that they are actually learning and knowing things by this procedure. I mean, in our modern sense, this is basically no different than the Bible code stuff of just mixing and matching until you get something you like to see and then run from there. But it basically means, where's the message coming from? It's coming from here, not from up there. If you really need a double check, you can always go up there, because that's what at least some of the Christians did. Paul talks about getting revelations all the time. In 2 Corinthians 12, there's a trip to the third heaven where either Paul or someone else, because Paul's trying to be a little bit cagey about who went up to heaven, but it's basically someone who goes up to paradise and gets attacked by Satan. This is, again, not normal procedure for learning about historical situations. This is not Paul going and interviewing witnesses or getting forensic evidence. He's not being Sherlock Holmes. He's being more like Aleister Crowley, if to give anything like a modern example.
Reminds me too of the Book of Enoch, some of the ways that he does a similar journey.
Exactly.
Does Justin Martyr happen to touch on Enoch, as far as you know?
Not that I remember. He is ultimately limited to Greek translations of the text. So in particular, when he's going to try to argue and defend the virgin birth, he has to depend on the Greek and deny that the Hebrew is actually authentic, because Justin has to be right. So he may not have had the easiest access to Enoch, but I mean, it must have been in Greek floating around, simply because in Jude there's a straight up citation of it, and there's other allusions to it elsewhere. But no place I can think of off the top of my head where he refers to First Enoch.
Gotcha. Is there any particular things when you were studying Justin that just kind of shocked you, that you hadn't heard of before or thought of before, in terms of the way they would have thought back then, the way he particularly did it? Is there anything that kind of surprised you?
The thing that perhaps surprised me the most is just when looking again at how he describes the Gospels as a source and how he uses them, just kind of blew my mind. Of like, almost every time I see Justin being cited, it's to show, well, here's an interpretation of the Gospels, or here's how we know when the Gospels were written. But I had to look again and notice that there were details about Justin doesn't say these are just simply the memoirs of the apostles, but even says apostles and later writers, basically giving the game away that, yeah, this is just an ongoing, continuously edited or slash made up document, and that he does not treat it as historical reportage. And no apologist brings that up. If anything, they're pointing out to Justin showing proof of when the Gospels were in circulation. To me, they're proof of how malleable they were as information about Jesus.
Makes you, in a funny sense, kind of chuckling about it, makes me think that, boy, if they could have had Google Docs and kind of collaborated, be like, yeah, I'm going to stick this sentence in. Oh, let's adjust the verbiage here. And oh, I'm a master of Pythagoreanism. Let me add a little bit of that here and spice it up. I mean, they obviously did that already, but what could they have done if they had Google Docs and could have remotely all chimed in? It's crazy.
Oh yeah.
So he's obviously eventually martyred. What was he killed for? Was it for this stuff?
So that I don't know the history of so well, if for no other reason, because I was so focused on Justin's writing. He wasn't there to write about being chewed on by lions or what have you.
Right.
So I'm vague on the details about what we know about Justin's final end. My understanding is he ultimately gets in trouble with the authorities and is killed, but I don't know enough of the details and how authentic they are, considering, like from Candida Moss's work, that a lot of the martyrdom literature out there is unreliable. I haven't investigated well to know how good the martyrdom literature on Justin is.
Gotcha. You mentioned Christian apologists and how they might respond to some of the stuff. How do they respond to it? And do you think that they are misunderstanding any key points of what Justin was up to and what he was thinking?
So let me put it this way. I haven't seen any Christian apologists even note that Justin divorces the Gospels from the traditional authors. They seem to just be saying, hey, they're saying memoirs of the apostles, and he's just being inclusive. So when he's referring to Mark and Luke, who are not disciples, this is his way of expanding beyond that. But perhaps not even aware of the part where Justin says, by the apostles and those who came later, which basically shows this can't be disciple writing. This is clearly later stuff. And the fact that Justin freely contradicts statements in the Gospels. As far as I don't know of any Christian apologist who has even noticed the contradictions, while the more critical scholarship looks at what Justin says and wonders, is Justin even reading the same books that we are? Just because if he's saying these things so different from what the Gospels say, is it just that the text is still that much in flux, even in the 150s? I think that's, a valid hypothesis. But on the other hand, Justin will cite things and then directly contradict the thing he just cited, like I mentioned with the Star of Bethlehem thing. So as far as I can tell, the text that Justin has is at least close to the canonized version of the Gospels. It's always, of course, hard to know just how different it is because we only have little snippets, but it's probably close enough. That and the fact also when I look at, say, Mark and Matthew, they are really coherently put together texts. It does not look patchwork in the same way as, say, the Gospel of John is, where things seem to be out of order. Where Jesus says, well, why haven't you guys asked this question when it's like, we asked it a chapter earlier. Jesus, you were there. Things that suggest like the pages are a little bit out of order, or that's been edited over so many times that things have gotten lost in the mix. Exactly. So the fact that Mark, or especially Matthew, seems to actually be really well constructed in a way that like the beginning and end seem to mirror each other using common language and themes in ways that really seems to be structured. And you wouldn't get that if like 10 different people are just like inserting stuff to their own whims. This suggests to me that whatever Matthew is, it's put together as a holistic body of text rather than just a grab bag of things. And that view of what Mark was, because Mark will have a lot of stories that seem to repeat. The feeding of the 5,000. Well, let's do another 5-ish thousand. It's like, does he just have two different versions? He's throwing it together? No, it actually looks like he's creating these sandwiches for interpretive purposes. So again, it looks more literary to me than just a collection of Aesop's fables.
Right. Yeah, and it definitely gives you the sense that they were very intentional about what they were doing, and they had messages that they wanted at least the inside track of initiates to understand, to say there's more here. And it's amazing to me, when you really realize what's going on here with these Gospels. Like, yes, in terms of a worldview, it's absolute garbage, but when you just look at it purely from a perspective of academics. It's like there's actually an incredible amount of amazing things here, because you figure they have to, number one, just be very literate to be able to write these whole stories and craft them, and the parallelism. Number two, they're bringing in all these Old Testament stories. Number three, they're bringing in the stuff from Odysseus and Homer's work. They're doing stuff from Plato. They're doing stuff from Neo-Pythagoreanism. They're doing all these different aspects of the philosophies of the day. Like, you need to know all this stuff and also be able to bring it in. They're bringing in some numerology and early gematria at times. I would argue that they're bringing in astrotheology at times. And it's like, you can't be stupid and bring all that stuff together and do it in a way that actually kind of makes fluid sense. And there was no ChatGPT back then to kind of make sure you were making sense of your arguments. And there's it makes me wonder, like, if it was a guy or a team of people at the Alexandria Library, or somebody that was like really trying to put some kind of like really hardcore effort into creating a new mystery cult that just would have stood the test of time. And obviously, if that was anybody's intention, it obviously did. It did stand the test of time. At least with the sword once Constantine came in this picture.
Right.
The $1 million question to me, and maybe this isn't the question everyone else is thinking about, but the $1 million question for me is, this has a lot of ramifications for mythicism. You and I have a lot of friends in the community that would definitely die on the hill that there was a guy. There was absolutely a guy. And, we love those friends and that we respect them, but there's different sides to this. The more that I look at information like Justin Martyr's stuff and a lot of other things, I think I'm not so sure. I'm not saying anybody should say definitively there definitely was a guy or there wasn't a guy. But I do think there's a chance to say there's some good arguments on both sides. It is not crystal clear. And what does this do to you for the mythicism argument? Like, where does it help the mythicist argument? Does it make the literalists who think there was a guy look more like they're ignoring the elephant in the room? Like, how does it seem to you?
So, because I think there is more behind the story than the literalist outcrop of what the text is, I think it helps a mythicist if they have the mission of not trying to uncover the historical Jesus, but trying to uncover the mythical Jesus. So there's basically been quote unquote quests for the historical Jesus going on for centuries, and the results have not been all that great, because they keep talking about we need to start another quest or declare another quest has started to figure out who the historical Jesus was with new methods and such, and over again finding out, we're basically trying to uncover who Jesus was, and what we end up finding is a mirror, and we're just seeing ourselves. That has been a criticism that other Jesus scholars have had. And so my approach here has been, whether they're historical Jesus or not, there's clearly a mythical Jesus, and this mythical version of Jesus seems to be at least as old as the historical Jesus, because you look at the letters of Paul. For him, Jesus is not just some bro you meet in the Galilee. He is a part of the kingdom of heaven right now, and he's literally basically on the side of God, not as just a dude. He's not Elijah. He is some sort of super angel. That's right there basically in the earliest writings of Paul. And my question then is, if there's this mythical Jesus, where did he go? And can we actually uncover more of what was the original Jesus myth? If that might even be the original Christian myth, and then the historical Jesus glommed on later, because that's the argument. Which of these is historically earlier? The myth of Jesus or some sort of historical figure that then led to the myth? I'm focusing on the myth now and seeing what we can get there. And I am also trying to argue that it can actually help us understand the origins of the gospel stories, which then tells me here's the direction of influence. It goes from myth to history rather than from history to myth. So part of my effort to try to interpret what Justin might be hiding is to get to the mysterious, the more mythical Jesus. So I have a current article on its way that's going to be published in Biblica in a matter of months. I'm not 100% sure when, but I've already seen the proofs of it and looking good. And I'm uncovering one of the weird, mysterious titles that Jesus has that the literature does not explain well, where in 2 books in the New Testament, Jesus is called the morning star. And if you decide, well, he's clearly coming from the Old Testament, and you flip through and you try to find the morning star, you basically get one example of that, and it's in Isaiah 14, where in its original historical context, it's talking about the Babylonian king, and later on, this becomes an interpretation of the fall of Satan. In other words,
Right.
This ain't where Jesus' name came from. So how does Jesus get this title of morning star? Where does it come from? What's its origins? And I'm using this exploration to figure out not only where this title comes from, then how it might actually fit into the larger story of the mythical Jesus himself. Because, interestingly enough, when I figure out where the title comes from, it explains another mystery. So if we open your hymnal and change the pages over to Revelation 12, and if you're trying to sing from Revelation, it's not going to be in tune. But if you get there, you have this vision of this woman in heaven who's hyper pregnant. She's standing on the moon. She has a crown with stars in it and clothed with the sun. There's a giant dragon in the sky that's taking down the stars. And a normal person looks at that and says, okay, what substance was used to make this vision? I try to figure out, okay, what are the textual reasons for this? Because there's all these other allusions to things in the Old Testament or even elsewhere in the book of Revelation. So while substance may have been involved in those interpretations, there's nonetheless citations or references to these texts. How does this come about? And my explanation for how Jesus gets the title of Morning Star is actually a combination of Psalm 110, where it says in the Hebrew and in certain Greek translations that the Lord, basically the guy who's going to be on the right-hand side of God, is born from the womb of dawn. That's actually what the Hebrew probably says. There's been a lot of arguments about the vowel pointing, but that seems to be the best reconstruction. And there's also that star prophecy that says that the Messiah will be a star. If you have a star born from the womb of dawn, what do you get? The morning star. So I think that title is explaining part of that vision, which also deals with a battle with Satan in the sky. You basically get the first Star War. And also, interestingly enough, there's another place where there's a Star War that involves the morning star. And this is in another Jewish text called the Sibylline Oracles. And this is the 5th of the Sibylline Oracles. At the very end, it basically has this giant Star War. And basically, the heavenly man who's going to end the world is also referred to as the morning star, and basically destroys all the other stars in the heavens and sends them down to boil up the oceans. And you realize, oh, wow, there seems to be a common connection here, that there's this general myth of basically battles happening in the skies that involve this figure. And I'm thinking this is part of the imagery of Revelation. And I think it's also behind the interpretation of Justin's view of the Christmas story, because he's bringing in demons. He's bringing in Satan. He says Herod the Great is the king of Assyria, which, as you might know from your history, ain't the truth. There had been no Assyria at that time for 5 centuries. So he definitely couldn't have been. So it has to be symbolic. But elsewhere, he also refers to a Herod as the devil. And he also makes a conflation of all the Herods together. So Herod's son is the same thing as Herod, who's also somehow at the time of the Greek translation of the Old Testament in the 3rd century, which makes Herod immortal. All sorts of weird stuff. But I realized if I pull back the curtain and see it in light of this other interpretation, I realize, oh, this might be how Justin is understanding the Christmas story, and how I think Matthew is writing his story. If, based on some other arguments I'm currently in the process of trying to write up and publish, to say, we're going from this Star War in heaven, and now it is being rewritten and turning into a more close to home event in a historical setting. And that's my argument for basically how the Gospels develop. If this is true, if the mystery I impart onto you is of the Holy Spirit, then what it would suggest is indeed the way Christianity developed is more from myth to historical story, rather than from history to super Jesus story.
I gotta say, this 1,000-foot view, my thoughts on things like this. When you look at the Christians that think this is all real, And, you're spending your time on it from an academic perspective, just trying to be a historian, as it were, and a good interpreter of literature. And you think there are Christians that spend their lives thinking, today as well as back in his day, but thinking we are learning the true divine mysteries from the true creator, that the God that is, started this whole thing and whom will eventually be judged. And it's just like, you all, according to Paul, like Paul says, if Christ is not raised, we are of all men to be most pitied. And to think there are people that go to seminaries and Bible colleges, myself included, I'll raise my hand, Bible colleges, seminaries, and on it goes, spending their lives saying, dear God, please reveal to us these wonderful mysteries of your truths. And then when you look at stuff like this, you just think, you Christians have not got a clue where this thing came from, and you have no idea what it is. And you're just, pardon my expression, but just bluntly, they're just making shit up. They made shit up back then, and they're doing it today. It's like, it's just a variation on the theme. It's just, let's just make stuff up, and let's ignore the stuff that is convenient to ignore, and let's focus on the stuff that's convenient, that fits in. Everything from the real basic stuff, like let's ignore the genocides of the Old Testament. Let's focus on God is love and turn the other cheek and love your neighbor, to some of the deeper stuff like you're dealing with. And it really does shock me when you think about it. And as you know, my channel is less about academics, such as awesome channels like Myth Vision and things like that. But when I look at the great work that you and others do with working with Myth Vision and those other channels, and you expose this information, I love it on the one side because I'm learning so much, and I get a better education, and I figure out how to ask better questions and how to remove hopefully some stupid questions. And at the same time, at the same level, there's like this other track. It's like, I cannot believe I freaking gave my life to this mythology. And it continues to blow me away that this stuff actually still has a place in our society. And speaking of our society, I'm just curious, respond to that if you want to, but also, what do you think Justin would think if he could see what we've done with Christianity?
Oh, wow. So he would probably find plenty of people to be angry with, considering the immense diversity of Christians, and only he has the right Christianity, just like everyone else claims. He probably would fit in well in the same vicious debates that happen. It would be curious to see what would happen if he went to, like, say, the Evangelical Theological Society for debates and things like that. Because, again, at times he's saying, like, I completely believe everything the Old Testament says, but you look a little bit more deeply and say, except you changed that. It's like, I guess so much for an errant. He would have some arguments or some cakes thrown at him, or cream pies, basically a Three Stooges skit happening if he went to some of these debates, I think. But what can I say? Our society is good at, as you say, making things up and getting angry about the things we made up. So if I may do a plug to have you convert to the one true Godzilla. This is actually a project my wife and I are working on. We're actually in the process of writing a book related to Godzilla and the various movies in that franchise. But she is a PhD in English, so we're using like a lot of her tool set for this. So the only god that I can be sure affects us today is from Japan.
Nice. It's fascinating stuff. Just curious, when you do present this kind of information to other atheists and people that would agree that at the end of the day, whether Jesus was originally a guy that walked in Palestine or not, it's irrelevant to our lives today. It's an academic study at best.
Oh yeah.
But for the people that would land more on the historicist side, what would they do with information like this, do you think?
So at least everything I am trying to argue is, I think, compatible with historicity, and the evidence does not require Jesus mythicism, so it doesn't use it as a premise. What I think it does is just allows a better theoretical foundation for doing a mythicist project. So in the same sort of way that you can do a lot of science in multiple paradigms, that it might fit multiple theories of gravity or multiple theories of what dark matter is, or what have you what the subject might be. So trying to do lots of good normal science that might then help push towards a revolution, but can still stand on its own. So I'm trying to do the observations and the work that can help us better understand whatever paradigm is going to be best that can stand on its own, but ultimately thinking the paradigm that actually has, I think, the most fruit to expand and explore is the mythicist paradigm. So that's kind of like where I use it to basically say it allows me the insights to look for these sorts of things, because the historical Jesus stuff doesn't, I think, inspire me to look at the evidence in this way.
I'm not sure if I understand when you say it doesn't go against the historicist perspective. It sounds like it goes against it a lot. Because, I mean, like, if there was a guy, why would they need to make all this shit up? If it was like, no, like, you can make stories up if you want to, but like, we have a pile of real stories. We know what he really did. We know what he really said.
Yeah.
Your stories are superfluous. We have his real stuff. Like, why go, and why not preserve those at least parallel, instead of just like, it looks like everything is copied from the Old Testament or Homer, you know?
Yeah, so I think the paradigm a historist can still say is there was a guy and he was mythologized extremely quickly and so greatly that it makes it really hard to get back to the historical Jesus, but there was nonetheless someone there to explain how it got off the ground, and it then exploded into mythology, and even to the point of combining him with all sorts of other mythical figures. So here's something I could imagine a historist could do. So even with my paradigm of there being a mythical Christ figure, let's say this idea existed in the first century, just as a hypothetical, that everything I say is right, and here is this mythical Jesus mythology created. What they could ultimately say is that guy over there who we were following, who is now dead, actually was this other figure the whole time, and combine it with those sorts of things. And they could just say in the same sort of way, John the Baptist, historical figure, Christians say he was also Elijah in some way. I could imagine a historist could make that kind of argument with Jesus. There was a historical dude and then got attached to all these other mythical paradigms. So that's how I could imagine a historist could argue. And my counter ultimately to that would just be, where's the direct evidence for that? It just seems that now the historical Jesus is mere hypothesis. And so to me, it's just a question of which hypothesis can explain the most data without the least number of add-ons.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. It's interesting. Just as a quick side, I had interviewed somebody a while ago that said something that I've since heard it repeated by other people, and I was curious of your take on it. We were talking about in that particular interview how there's a lot of copies of what Jesus did with the god Orion, and we were going through it, and I was kind of coming to some similar conclusions, like as I'm doing with you, like, yeah, this is crazy how it's another mythology. And this gentleman's response was, he was challenging me, and he said, wait a second, I'm not saying it's not true. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, when you hear the word mythology, does that to you mean it's not true? I was like, correct. It means it's not true. He's like, that's not how they saw it in the ancient world. Just because it was mythology did not mean it was not true. And I've heard this explained over and over and over from different angles, and every which way I've ever heard it, it sounds like the stupidest explanation. I've never processed it in a way that makes sense to me, where I'm like, oh, I see what you're saying. It just sounds like the stupidest thing to say. But for I think what they're at least trying to say is, maybe even though it's garbage to us today, that it's at least helpful to understand their world back then. Not that we should adopt it today, but to say their world back then this was actually truth as much as they understood it. And it sort of relates in a sense to that C.S. Lewis quote where he was arguing, isn't this just like another mythology? And he said, yeah, it is like the others, but it's the true one. In what way would you respond to somebody who would say, yes, this is mythology, but it's the true mythology, and just because it is mythologically based and sourced doesn't make it not true. And I don't mean just the sense of like there's some truisms in it, like be kind to your neighbor, but there's actually cosmic eternal truths to it. Oh, we have a visitor. Your visitor's going in and out of your green screen, but I can see enough of it.
Yes, this is my cat Venus.
It's like a transporter where the transporter is having trouble, and it's, where they gotta go in and phase in and out.
Oh yeah, of course. My worry is if I have an animal with the transporter with me, will it end up like The Fly, and I'm going to be
Yes,
fused with the cat? Ooh,
exactly.
ooh. Or will I become like Jeff Goldblum? To be determined.
Nice.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, the ancient world did not, or at least many in the ancient world, just did not think in the ways of facts as we do, or in scientific truth in that sort of way. So when they have a story, they may not necessarily say this is an account of what actually happened, but this is supposed to somehow tell us something that we need to know to act in the world. And it doesn't necessarily require that the story took place. So trying to think what would be a good historical analog, but maybe the best is that you feel some sort of moral instruction from watching some piece of fiction. You go and you watch a Marvel film, you know that Hulk smash is not something real, but you do know that good should triumph over evil, that sacrifice is required, and that now and forever Tony Stark is Iron Man. Important things that you need to know to be a good person or a good member of the tribe, things like that. So that sort of information can be true in the sense that it provides something needed to the individual or the community, but it's not actually telling you what really did happen. And honestly, I think that makes a lot of sense of mythology because of how the myths change. They're often changed on purpose, not because, we did some more historical digging and we realized, the worldwide flood didn't actually happen. It's like, no, we're going to change the story of the flood so that way we actually better explain what the relationship is between the gods and the humans. So the Enuma Elish, where the gods destroy the world because they want to get a good night's sleep, makes the gods look pretty awful. The Hebrew authors of Genesis writing their version or versions of the flood story, basically making God having to do this because the world is so terrible and wicked and is trying to fix it for some greater end, allegedly at least. It's not necessarily saying there was a flood and somehow the Hebrew authors know better. It's that this is what we need the story to say to get our purposeful message across. And we're saying this is our relationship with the divine, not based on what actually happened, but what these stories are supposed to communicate. Though I do have to wonder if you go back in time and ask a person, hey, this flood story, we know scientifically it did not happen. What does that do to them? I don't think we really know that answer all that well. So there might be, in the sense of their brain, a half-truth belief in these sorts of stories. And especially because we know many people did take these stories literally and became the butt of jokes amongst the intellectuals, or at least the people who call themselves intellectuals.
It seems like, on that note, it seems like there would be more people, like if they saw history the way we do and facts the way we do and truth the way we do, that there'd be more people going into these mystery cults saying, you're telling me the top line story, but then you later tell me that's not actually true, but there's a deeper truth to it. You'd think there'd be more people who'd be a little bit pissed off, be like thanks for telling me about level 2, but why did you tell me level 1 was like literal? And maybe back then there was a gullibility factor that is evolving out of our consciousness, but just the sense you'd think it's sort of like that thing we have now where kids get told Santa Claus is real. And, some families don't push that very hard, but if you were in a family that just pushed it and tried to give you little, magical hints like, oh, look, Santa ate the cookies you left out for him. And they're trying to literally get you to believe it as a kid. And then later on, you wake up and you're like, oh, this is just a story. It for a lot of people, there's at least that initial what the hell? Why did you trick me this far? I would have rather known the truth. Yeah, it felt magical, but now I feel like I'm this gullible as they come.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like they were, from what I've ever heard of historical things that have come up, it doesn't seem like that was an argument that they really cared about, to say, oh my goodness, we were so gullible. Now that we know level 2 and the deeper mysteries, we were just all these idiots on level 1. They don't seem concerned. They're just like, this is just part of the process. This is part of the process of becoming a better believer and of understanding the mysteries of the universe better. Is you have to start there because you're just not ready. It's like, you're not ready to be unplugged from the Matrix. We'll tell you the little that we can tell you for now. We'll give you more later. But by the time you get to the extra deep, profound levels, you're not pissed. You understood I needed that to get to here, and I wouldn't have been here if you hadn't taken me on this path. For me, I would have been pissed. I'm like, what the hell do you mean none of this actually happened? Moses wasn't real and Jesus didn't really walk on water. Like, what do you mean that didn't happen? You told me it did. You told me that, a year ago, and now you're telling me it didn't. It's just an allegory. It doesn't seem like they're upset about that kind of stuff,
Yeah. There's also some level of self-selection to that. First off, most people probably didn't even have the resources to explore the question because they were illiterate. And
Sure.
if it costs, a lifetime's worth of money to hire a teacher for a year, or to get supplies for schooling, or you might be paying tens of thousands of dollars for a single book, like in equivalent relations of like money back then versus now. Like a single book could be tens of thousands of dollars or even more if it's in really good shape. So it's like, yeah, this is going to be limited to a certain level of the strata of that society. And then those who get there are also going to be educated in things like Platonic thinking and allegorizing. In fact, there was an entire, there were collections of ways of interpreting myths. So I talked mostly about like Justin in allegorizing, and this was really popular amongst the Platonists, but you had people like Euhemerus, who basically writes a story that says all the gods were actually just originally people, and they set up cults of themselves. And so Zeus was originally a dude. He set up a cult to himself, and because he did such awesome works, he was praised and worshipped as a god even after he died. Aphrodite was just a really awesome prostitute, so she became known as the goddess of love, things like that. Dionysus, just awesome at making wine. Cult established to him. That's how he tried explaining things, is basically, here's what historically actually happened, and the story got all messed up. And there were similar things for other myths. So like, where does the story of the centaur come from? This half man, half horse thing. There was a group of people who rode horseback called centaurs, and when they did some sort of battle, some sort of cow wrestling, and were running off, people had never seen people riding horses before, see them running off. It's like, that looks like the top of a human, the bottom of a horse. That one animal? Oh, wow. There are half human, half horses out there. So there were definitely some people who were looking at those things literally and then trying to figure out what actually happened. But this is just such this is a subset of the elites of those societies. And you go back further in time, that subset's even smaller. You go back to ancient Sumer, literacy is even lower than it was in the Roman period, in part because the writing system was just so damn hard. It wasn't even an alphabetic system. It's like, I would love a vowel, but hey, these are, at least some of things are logographic. This is an entire word. And so if you want to understand what this text even says, you might need to know thousands of characters. In the same way, if you want to read a Chinese novel, you need to know thousands and thousands of different characters. And also, your teacher isn't going to be online, is going to be extremely expensive, and probably only in certain patrilineal groups. So it's like, yeah, the ancient Sumerians probably weren't going to be able to tell the priests, you lied to me, because they had no way of even beginning to find out. And the kings of that time, they'd usually at least be told, these are mysteries that you have to be inducted into. We know that's true for the Persians, that the Persian king would be entering into the mysteries of the Zoroastrian faith, and the Magi that control that. So there's a big difference between regular folks, the elite, and then even fractions of the elite who might even ask those questions.
It's interesting. It's almost like I always thought of Christianity as like a poor man's religion. Just like, I just believe whatever I'm told, just swallow the party line. But in some ways, it's also rich man's religion. It's like, if you're really going to know this stuff, like the true inside track, you got to have some money, and you got to be an initiate, and you got to go to the special school. But I guess there are some parallels even to my time at Bible college and to people that go to seminary, where you do literally get the inside track. I mean, reading the Bible, even as a current Christian, is very different if you just read it in English versus if you've gone and studied Hebrew and Greek and so forth. Like, there are levels of understanding that do get very dramatically different based on your education level. But I know we're almost out of time. I just want to ask a few final questions. Number one, I probably should have asked this before, but can people get a hold of your research article, or how can they get a hold of it? Will it be on your website, or what's the best way to get that information?
I haven't made a copy of it easily accessible, and I'm rewriting it in the process to actually put it out there for publication.
Okay.
I'd gotten some advice from a couple people at SBL of where it would publish well, so I'm going to write it up in a way that can be nice and professional. But if the version I have that I've shared with you, for example, if that got out there publicly, I wouldn't complain.
Gotcha. Is there anything, I
But
mean, that's going to be on your website, or where would people read it or buy it when it is in the final form?
assuming if it gets published, it'd probably be in the various academic journals, which means it's going to be behind stupid paywalls, or you have a friend at a library or something like that. So
Gotcha. Okay.
unfortunately, very few journals, especially in biblical studies, are open source. Or if they are open source, you have to like pay like thousands of dollars up front. So I'm a cheap bastard, so that probably won't happen.
Well, I appreciate you
but
bringing us some insights, at least verbally today. I'm just curious, with SBL, is that a hyper conservative evangelical group, or do they see you as a heretic? Do they see you as acceptable?
quite the opposite. So first off, to be a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, all you have to do is pay your dues. And if you go to the conference, so I mean, you had to submit an abstract or a paper and have someone in those panels say that this is acceptable for their discussions. So it has to, reach some level of academic rigor or quality. But basically, the vast majority of people presenting there are other academics, and they're critical scholars primarily. If you do go, you will see people walking around. And it's like that person just got here from the monastery, because they are in the exact same garb. And so some of the talks are theology talks, some of it rigorous, detailed scholarship about literally like one of the papers I sat in on was someone literally going through and counting how often different verb forms are in the Hebrew text to try to help date them. So literally going through and counting up how many times like a yod is used versus other letters. It's like clearly stuff that isn't going to make people salivate in the pews saying praise Jesus. And so when I show up, if a paper of mine is accepted, it's usually of a standard where it leads to good discussion, and I feel like more of a member of the community than I should, given the fact I'm not professionally trained in this area.
Are there many evangelical Christians that come into those groups and kind of try to steer it back to a literalist perspective and a Christian perspective?
For the most part, those doing that are kind of at their own thing. So the Evangelical Theological Society will often have their own meeting, like pretty much next door to SBL. So it gets some of that academic glow in their direction. But also at SBL, you'll have other evangelicals. Like, I didn't see him this last time, but one of my friends did. William Lane Craig was there giving some sort of talk, or was there for some sort of roundtable discussion. The last time I remember seeing Craig there, he was this was at SBL in Denver, and he was part of a panel about how to make the Adam and Eve story compatible with modern genetics. So talks like that are happening in some rooms. Other rooms are doing really esoteric stuff with the Hebrew language. Other people are, like me, trying to figure out mythical relationships between stuff and how these stories develop. It's a collection of, conservative to atheist, as long as everyone can make an argument worth listening to in a ultimately reasonable, grounded, and I would even say secular fashion.
It's interesting hodgepodge of perspectives there. I would think it'd be kind of weird almost to be like, watching someone give a presentation like yours and then see the guy who's the monk coming in and be like, before we start, let's say a word of grace to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Are you listening? Oh, it's crazy. Well, for anybody that does, like myself, just like we really do admit we don't know what we don't know, and that's a dangerous place to be. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. What would you say, and this will be my last question, then you can give us any final parting shots as well on your mind, but what's a good place to start just to get better educated? What would you say to people like me that just, we really do need to learn more about this stuff, and we know it does make a difference. We don't always have the time we want to put into it, but when we can do it, we want to understand these conversations better, and maybe get into them, but at least understand what you all are talking about. What's a good starting point?
Yeah, so there fortunately are resources that experts have put together to at least tell you or show you what the consensus position is in the field and how they defend it. In the New Testament, Bart Ehrman is probably the number one source for that. And even if it's something that I happen to disagree with him on, he is probably doing the best job out there to explain what the consensus position is and arguments for that are at least quite reasonable and need to be engaged with before you take the crazier views that I might take. More and more, they are trying to put things in easier to access digital format. So podcasts or videos. Books, though, is probably still going to be the best way. If you really need to get into the details, you almost certainly have to read. You can't listen to a podcast and expect to get the depth of engagement as you would going through the page, looking at the footnotes, looking at the references, and looking at the refutation, the refutation, the refutation of the refutation. But nonetheless, if you want a fun starting point, one of the panels at SBL, actually a couple of the panels at the SBL, were devoted to a particular film that came out, Satan's Guide to the Bible. And while I was there, I got to meet the director and the voice of Satan as they had a discussion with several experts from the film, giving their feelings about the film as well. And their critiques were useful to the film, but one thing they didn't say was anything was factually wrong in the film. So if you want Satan to teach you a thing or two and will actually do a good job of telling you where critical scholarship is on the historicity of the Exodus, or if the Jesus message was false and apocalyptic, Satan's going to tell you right. So I would start there, perhaps.
Do you know if SBL stuff is publicly available, or is that just private discussions?
Some people might post their stuff later on, but for the most part, it's a place to have those discussions and then turn them into articles or books to then sell. It's like that with most other academic societies. Get people together so that way they can talk about their papers so they can write more papers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up today?
I have to say it's always a pleasure coming on here to talk more, and hopefully I will have more things published to share and get maybe a little bit closer to the mythical truth.
That's awesome. Yeah, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to that Morning Star article too. That sounds really exciting. Well, thank you so much. It's great. Always great to see you too, and so great to hear the great work you're doing. And I feel so inspired when I see people digging into stuff and like, I know there's great nuggets of truth here and great historical things. I just want to do it. And there's always so many books and so little time, as they say, but we'll get there. But anyway, I'll wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Dr. Aaron Adair. I'll have some links beneath this video where you can go check out and connect with him more. But Dr. Adair, thank you so much. Great to talk to you today, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.